All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. It's 11 o'clock, so I will go ahead and get started with some general housekeeping. And as anybody joins, if you would like, you can add your name and contact information to the chat for networking. This is the last session of this first Echo series. We started last June, I want to say, so it's been about a year. So if you've been to some of these before, you've seen these housekeeping rules, but this will be our final session for this specific series. These sessions are always recorded, so similarly, this will be recorded today. If by participating in this session, you are consenting to be recorded. If at any point you would like to not be recorded, you can leave the session. And this recording will be available later on our Canvas platform if you'd like to come back and watch the session again or share it with someone. A few things, we've been in the Zoom world for a while now, but if you would like to rename your profile, or if you would like to raise your hand to ask a question at any point, we can help you do that. Our Hub team members have this Echo background. It's the background behind me. It has this Echo logo in the corner. If you have any questions about functionality of Zoom or help changing your name or raising your hand like we have here, you can send one of us a message and I can help you figure that out. Because this is an Echo, we will have a case session, a case discussion at the end, and you may also have questions related to cases that you're working with currently, real life scenarios. So if you do share information about another person, we just ask that you try to protect their privacy. So avoid using their real first, middle, or last name or initials. Don't share any identifying information like an address or family members, relatives. So do your best to de-identify examples and situations. And if you have a question about something you want to share but you're not sure, again, you're welcome to message me or another member of the Hub team. This is an Echo session, which is different than your traditional webinar. We welcome engagement from you all. We'll start out with a didactic presentation, and then we'll have a case scenario. You are more than welcome to comment, discuss, write down questions as we have our didactic presentation. We would love to address them afterwards. So this really works best when we're all engaged and we're all participating. So I would love to hear from you all later on. We'll start out with that didactic presentation, as I mentioned, and end with a case presentation and discussion. This is a community of practice style session rather than that traditional webinar, as I mentioned. So we're hoping that you will share your knowledge with us and we can share our knowledge with you, and we will all learn from each other that way. As this is the last session, we aren't collecting case scenarios for these topics anymore, but we will have a session starting this fall in August. We will have a new series for case managers and support coordinators. If you are interested in that series, we'll have information out soon, and we will still be collecting case scenarios for that. So if that's something you're interested in, we will have that information out within the next week or so, and you'll be able to send in information for that if you'd like. We are still offering CEUs through the Utah Social Work Association. So if you would like to receive that CEU, you'll need to fill out our survey. We would love to hear from you in that survey. Even if you would not like a CEU, you can request a certificate of attendance. We'd love to know what you think about the session so we can make sure that we're improving as needed. And we will drop that link in the chat. We will still maintain our Canvas page that will house everything from this first series. If you haven't joined yet and you would like to, that's where you can access all of our previous sessions, all of the resources that have been shared. You can send an email to mhidd@aggies.usu.edu and we can get you set up. I'll also drop that email in the chat so you can do that later if you would like. And we do maintain our social media where we keep information about this Echo series, as well as future Echo sessions that you may be interested in. We have a Facebook and an Instagram page. This QR code will take you there if you are interested. it's a great way to keep up to date as to what we've got going on. As I mentioned earlier, this is the last session of this first series. We will have an additional series starting this fall that's specifically for support coordinators and case managers. Anyone is welcome to join. It's not limited to support coordinators and case managers alone. That's just the population we have had in mind. It'll be a variety of mental health and support related topics, and we'll have that info out hopefully within the next week. Today, we are super lucky to have Jessica Hooper and Katie Barber here to talk to us about the new reporting guidelines, some quick introductions from me, and then I'll turn the time over to Jessica and Katie. Jessica has worked for the Utah Department of Health and Human Services for 24 years. Most of her career has included quality management work with DHHS contracted providers that support individuals with disabilities, youth, and families supported by services for people with disabilities, juvenile justice and youth service, and child and family services. Jessica currently manages the external quality review team for DHHS's Office of Services Review. Her team focuses on oversight and technical support to DHHS contracted providers to ensure quality support and services are being provided to Utahns that have interactions with the DHHS agencies. Katie Barber has been with the Utah Department of Health and Human Services for 5 years. She joined the Office of Licensing, OL, after legislation was passed to increase regulations governing licensed residential youth settings. She's currently part of the investigations team for OL, providing compliance training and technical assistance for programs throughout Utah. And I will turn the time over to you, Jessica and Katie.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Thank you to the Institute for putting this together, especially Rachel for organizing this and working with DHHS. I won't go over my introduction again, but I'm Katie. I work with the Office of Licensing, which has overlap with the Office of Service Review. If you can never see my screen for some reason, please let me know. If you have any questions, like Rachel mentioned, please speak up, take some notes, and we'll be happy to go over any questions that anybody has. Today's session will be about critical incident and incident reporting. So this touches both of our offices at the Department of Health and Human Services. And our office, the Office of Licensing, my office, actually created a rule that outlines what the requirements are for any license setting. So that obviously impacts DSPD providers. And we just had our rule updated recently, as Rachel mentioned. So there are some new requirements. We also have a relatively new software that I'll touch on a little bit, so to report those things. All right, let's hop into it. So the objectives of this presentation is to understand the difference between critical and non-critical incidents. It's to gain an understanding of reporting requirements. It's to know when and how to report an incident. Also understand the incident report follow-up process. All right, so why is incident reporting important? Reporting an incident is important because it helps the Department of Health and Human Services to ensure that the health, safety, and welfare of the individual receiving the services is kept up. It ensures us a little bit of oversight over our providers. So it ensures the safety of the individual by identifying needed supports and services. So if there's a gap, incident reporting and trends over time regarding providers can help inform those gaps. It can mitigate preventable incidents. Like I mentioned, it helps us identify trends for both the individual and the system as a whole. So it helps us in a regulatory sense, and it also helps the end user. It helps our support coordinators. It helps our providers, and obviously those individuals receiving services. It also is just helpful in communication of events. So along the chain, everybody's informed. We can always go back as an office to look at what happened, and it's a good way to have a first step in making everybody know what has happened and how those providers are then going to either mitigate something or how they responded to it, which can then, down the line turn into trainings like this one. Like my bio mentioned, I also offer technical support for providers. So if we have trends, like we might see trends that maybe outline some opportunities for additional support, that's where somebody like me or one of our investigators, maybe somebody from Jessica's office, can go in and provide that technical assistance to our providers. Right. So we'll walk through what a critical incident is. And as I mentioned, this is outlined in the Office of Licensing rule for all providers. So a critical incident means an event out of the range of normal experience, and it might include kind of a long list of things that happen. So I'm actually going to refer to what we call our critical incident reporting guide, and we'll walk through these things. So the first bullet point here is an allegation or confirmation of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. So abuse is defined in multiple rules for the Department of Health and Human Services. It's also defined in our Office of Licensing statute and a couple other statutes. So abuse means knowingly or intentionally attempting to cause harm, causing harm, placing another in fear of harm, using unreasonable or inappropriate use of physical restraint, medication, or isolation that causes or is likely to cause harm to a vulnerable adult. It might also include emotional or psychological abuse. It could be a sexual offense. And it could also mean a deprivation of something that that client needs. So life-sustaining treatment, medical treatment, mental health treatment. Neglect means abandonment or failure to provide services that are necessary to somebody's well-being. So that might be nutrition, education, clothing, shelter, sleep, bedding, supervision, healthcare, hygiene, treatment, or protection from harm. Exploitation could mean variable things, but as we know, it has to be reported to APS or law enforcement, and that might look like somebody might be exploiting a client for their labor. They could be exploiting a client for somebody's personal satisfaction, like sexual satisfaction, but it has a kind of a multitude of different definitions, and it's not necessarily we know it when we see it, but it's definitely something that could be found to be an outcome of an incident that happened. So if you ever suspect something is exploitation, go ahead and report it anyway. It doesn't necessarily need to meet the exact definition, and we'll go over reporting requirements a little bit later too. A critical incident could also mean a loss or impairment of the function of a bodily member, an organ, a mental faculty, or it could result in a significant disfigurement. It might be a death related to an adverse event. It could be a death of a minor. Particularly these cases, it goes over this in our incident reporting guide. Those things should be reported if they happen under the purview of the provider. Or maybe you take a field trip as a provider and you have those clients with you. If something happens under responsibility of the provider, that's when it rises to the level of a critical incident. So for example, if we have a hospice provider and a death occurs, they don't need to report that necessarily because it is not considered something outside the range of a normal experience, first of all. And then also it's kind of just what happens. Whereas if you are on a field trip, somebody gets hit by a car or something, and it results in a medical emergency or death, obviously that's a little bit different because it's not within the range of normal experience. A critical incident could also be a medication error. This should be reported to us if somebody else is involved in that medication error or it results in something that has a detrimental impact, like a hospitalization. So if you call poison control due to something, then we want to know about it. If somebody takes one extra ibuprofen, it's not necessarily a medication error. We might not necessarily need to know about that. But if it falls under this definition where I did call the poison control center, then we would need a critical incident report for that incident. Continuing on, critical incidents could be an allegation or confirmation of waste, fraud, or abuse of Medicaid funds. Pretty straightforward there. Any medical emergency beyond basic first aid. So like I mentioned, if somebody that is basically a bystander who might have training in first aid is not able to sufficiently stop whatever's happening, and that needs to be reported to us. So like a superficial scrape, probably that's going to be able to be addressed by basic first aid, but if that person then goes to urgent care because they continue to bleed, that's considered a critical incident. A missing client would be a critical incident. Any significant criminal activity would be a critical incident. I would definitely invite you to look at the critical incident reporting guide for this, but we define significant criminal activity as any unlawful activity by or against a provider's clients or on-duty staff members that poses a serious threat to their health, safety, or well-being. That could be when law enforcement gets involved. If law enforcement is getting involved in something, then a critical incident report needs to be submitted. If there's physical or sexual misconduct or assault, that needs to be submitted. If it's like a riot, that's a good example of a criminal activity. Again, outside of Medicaid funds, if there is something going on like fraud or, exploitation of somebody for their money or something like that, that's also considered criminal activity and should be submitted. If your policies for whoever provider you're working with go over contraband and they have a list and contraband is found with the client while that client is being served by the provider or on site of the provider's location, then that would also need to be submitted as a critical incident. Okay, next item here is any property damage or infestation that jeopardizes services. So if there's something that's compromising the immediate health and safety of a client, then we need to know about that. So if it's a weather event or a fire or bed bug infestation, something that's going to compromise their well-being, then that should be submitted. You can always refer to the CDC's guidelines for outbreaks or pandemics. It's a topical topic. And we at DHHS do try to make it clear what we expect as far as things like a pandemic and when things do and do not need to be reported. Right now, our office doesn't expect that a case of COVID would be reported. If there's an outbreak as defined by either the county or the CDC, then that would need to be reported. And then lastly here, we have the misuse or unauthorized use of restrictive interventions or seclusions. This rule is meant to kind of touch more on those settings for youth. So it might not apply to you, but so you know, if something is happening that violates the statute as far as a restraint, or if, for example, a restraint is used for somebody who might have a restraint outlined as an acceptable practice to respond to a behavior in their behavior support plan, but if that restraint is not used in a way that matches the behavior support plan, then that would need to be reported because it's considered misuse of that restraint. Then, as we have here in highlight yellow, if you ever have a doubt about something that happens and you're not sure if it meets the definition of a critical incident, go ahead and report it anyway, because you will never be penalized for submitting something. You will never be penalized for anything like over-reporting. It's just not a thing. You would much rather know about it, even if it ends up not being a critical incident, not know about it. Okay. Kind of the guidelines for critical incidents. An incident must be reported if the incident occurs at the licensed location, while under the program's care, or when the program becomes aware of the incident. So like I mentioned, you're out for field trip, you might not be on the site of like a treatment program, but even in that case, you need to report it as a critical incident. And sometimes you don't know if something happened. So as soon as you become aware of a critical incident, it's expected that you report that critical incident. So you know, it's Office of Licensing's responsibility to have a procedure by which all licensees can report, one, the use of a restraint or seclusion, and two, just a critical incident in general. So it's kind of separated out in our statute a little bit. So all restraints and seclusions, they should be reported. DSPD, maybe Jessica can talk about this a little bit more. That has a little bit of a different requirement. Like I mentioned, technically, if something happens, like if a restraint occurs and it is within somebody's behavior support plan, you might not expect that of a provider, and especially if it's not outlined in your contract to report that. And then also, it has to be within 1 business day. So technically, a critical incident, as soon as it happens, after you've addressed the situation or after you become aware of it, that's when you need to submit that critical incident, because we need to know about it as soon as possible. And that's outlined in our statute. For individuals who might be involved in the DSPD system, critical incidents must be reported through UPI, must include any additional information as required by UPI. And then I'll talk about this a little bit later, but Office of Licensing staff assigned to process and evaluate these incidents will then refer them internally. And if the incident involves a licensee and rises to the definition of a critical incident, then we'll escalate that. And as I noted just a second ago, you might want to refer to your contracts as DSPD providers, if that's applicable to you, to see if there's any other reporting requirements in your contracts. And like I mentioned, if a behavior support plan outlines specific interventions that were correctly used in an incident, then an individual report is not necessary unless there was a misuse or there was an injury, like something results that was not intended as a result of using the restraint. Okay. So our office does have some requirements for training and for documentation. So the first item here is that the licensee shall ensure that each staff receives pre-service training on general incident reporting before being left unsupervised and within 30 days of hire. So that should happen for any staff that are involved with the provider. And also, that training needs to include what at minimum is required for reporting critical incidents, and then also any other requirements that a licensee might want to integrate into their training and require for their critical incidents. They're absolutely able to weave that into employee training. So we'll go over what at a minimum is required for our office, but if there are any, like if a business wants to expound on what they require, that's totally okay. And then another responsibility of licensees is that they are to collect, maintain, and submit original witness statements and supporting documentation, including video footage if available, regarding each critical incident. So I would say that unless we're going to open an investigation, we won't need these, and you're not required to proactively submit stuff to us as part of the critical incident report, that minimum that we need. But technically, each provider is required to collect and maintain anything that's related to that critical incident. All right. So how do you report the critical incident? So as I mentioned, it needs to be reported within 1 business day. The client's legal guardian, if applicable, must be notified within 24 hours of the incident. If the incident involves a client or youth in custody of DHHS, then immediate notification to the Office of Licensing is required. And as I mentioned, each licensee is required to collect, maintain, and submit supporting documentation or video footage or whatever you might have as the office needs it. So we define, so immediate notification, that is defined as sooner than the 1 business day where possible, but not so immediately that you can't address the situation that's going on. So just as a guideline here, I've included, for example, a provider who waits to report a death OL for an entire business day would be found in noncompliance, because that's a huge thing if somebody is in the custody of DHHS, and we need to know about that. So it's just an example there.
We had a question in the chat, and I think that mostly cleared it up, but it was, do you wait until Monday, for example, if an incident happens on the weekend?
Yes. Yep. So you don't have to wait, but technically you are in compliance with the requirements if you wait, if only 1 business day has passed.
Thanks.
Okay. I didn't miss, okay. Yeah, definitely interrupt me if I missed anything else. Sorry, I missed the chat. Okay. So here are the current requirements. These are not actually laid out in our law, but this is what our system asks for right now. So these things might change, but for right now, what we have is we need obviously who is submitting the critical incident and their contact information. We need to know when it happened, what time it happened, what type of incident it was, possibly where it happened, if that's pertinent to the, like if you were off site, where did that happen? We need the client and witness identifying information. We also need to know whether or not what happened resulted in a death or if the client was seen by somebody for medical attention. We need to know how it occurred in the first place. We need to know what the supervision was like when that critical incident happened, how you resolved the critical incident, and then any additional information just to expound on the story or any additional information that relates to our rule. You can include in the critical incident report. Those last two items are kind of optional, but I will say the more information we have, the better. So here's where I'll go into that a little bit. So first of all, we do prefer that the full names of the staff and clients that are involved in the critical incident are submitted to us. When you submit using just initials, then we would need to ask, you need to be able to provide us a key of which employees those are. So it might be just easier to use full names when possible, either employees or clients if you're using initials. So that's a helpful tip. It's not a requirement, just a tip. Then again, also notification of the incident should be, I mentioned it needs to go to the guardian if there's a legal guardian in place. And then also it's expected that the caseworker, support coordinator, whoever's not aware of the incident when it happened and is reporting it should be made aware of the critical incident. And then one thing I like to tell anybody who's writing a critical incident report is think of it as a story and you're telling us who, what, when, where, why. So what detail are you including to really tell the story of what happened? And also, where are you able to tell us how you did comply with the rule requirements? For example, if you had a report of a restraint, let's say you were on a field trip with some clients, you took them to the movies, one of the clients starts trying to get out of the car, and you have to kind of, maybe you start with you stop the car and maybe start with some verbal de-escalation, try to calm that client down, but then they start making a move to really walk into traffic and get out of the vehicle. Maybe then you have to get a little bit physical with them, as is outlined in their behavior support plan. So in that case, how are you telling us that you complied with the rule or with any requirements for restraints? Saying like, well, I did do, for example, if the rule requires that you do de-escalation first, include that. Say, I did comply with this because XYZ, and you tell the story of what happened. And any opportunity you have to say, well, I complied with this, that's helpful for us as an office because it fills in any gaps. It tells us that there should not be any concerns because in every opportunity you complied with whatever the requirement is. And then as a final note here on this slide, no investigation should be happening unless they're by DHHS. An investigation for any businesses, any licensees can occur internally after an investigation is completed by our office, but it's not up to a support coordinator, it's not up to a case manager to do that initial investigation. Okay. I'll turn the time over to Jessica.
Thanks, Katie. So as Katie made clear, critical incidents are required to follow everything that she mentioned. Critical incidents are also described in DHHS contracts, but the expectation is you're following all of the things that were outlined before. But there are also situations where non-critical incidents occur that are applicable to needing to be reported within DHHS contract agreements. So for anybody funded through DHHS for services, so anybody that DSPD is paying for the support services on through a contract agreement, non-critical incidents are outlined in those contract agreements and need to be reported through your DHHS agreement systems. So a non-critical incident are events that occur that the department needs to track for whatever reason. So some of these are high-risk areas that DSPD needs to track. Some of these are federal waivers require tracking on. Some of them it's just trends to help ensure services are meeting people's needs. So some of the items that have to be tracked as a non-critical incident include admission to psychiatric facilities, suicidal ideation or threats of suicide when the individual does not have services or supports in place that are already addressing these. So if somebody has support needs around this mental health issue of suicide ideation and suicide threats, and there's a clear support plan in place that the team is utilizing and discussing and reviewing frequently, that would not be seen as a non-critical incident for that individual. But if somebody that does not have suicide ideation or is not typically being supported with threats of suicide, then that would need to be reported as a non-critical incident. Use of emergency behavior interventions as defined in Utah Administrative Code Rule 539-4. This is a rule that was created specifically for DSPD services. So any agreement partners with DHHS that are providing supports need to be familiar with this administrative code rule so that it allows for the use of emergency behavior interventions and de-escalation techniques when health and safety issues are at play. But if you are providing ongoing support, as Katie mentioned earlier, those de-escalation techniques that you're using as an ongoing behavior support plan, if you were following those appropriately, nobody got injured, that would not constitute emergency behavior intervention that needed to be reported. But if that is not in place for that person and it meets that Utah Administrative Code Rule 539-4, then that needs to be reported as well. Instances of aspiration or choking, which do not result in hospitalization, would need to be reported to the department as a non-critical incident. Evidence of seizure and seizure-like behavior in individuals that do not have pre-existing seizure diagnosis would need to be ruled out. Would need to be reported. I apologize. And if you have a behavior support plan in place and there's monthly reporting on the behavior summary and it's related to seizure-like behavior, then you would use your behavior support plan. But if there's no behavior support plan, no existence of a seizure diagnosis, then you would need to report these as a non-critical incident. Any incident that involves alleged or confirmed waste, fraud, or abuse of Medicaid funds by either the provider or a recipient of Medicaid services needs to be reported. Any involvement of an outside entity, such as the fire department, law enforcement, needs to be reported. So if you have interaction with emergency responders, even if it does not result in charges or anything like that, then you still need to report that. If somebody is attempting to elope from detention or a secure facility, if there's an unauthorized possession of pornographic material, please keep in mind for DSPD specific providers, federal settings rule is in place here. So this is typically in our agreements for juvenile justice and youth services and child and family services, but for DSPD supported individuals, settings rule comes into play with choices they're able to legally make as adults for any adult material that they are legally authorized to have. So any pending litigation that is specifically related to the provider services or to an individual receiving services needs to be reported. Those would all be instances of non-critical supports. Reporting process and requirements for the non-critical instances. So initial notification must be made within 24 hours to the appropriate case manager, parent, guardian, caseworker, and support coordinator. This, if it's a DSPD specifically funded individual, is made through UPI. We like to use a lot of acronyms, so just so that everybody's clear, USTEPS is DSPD's system. It stands for Utah System for Tracking Eligibility, Planning, and Services. This is their case manager facing system that both contracted and state employed case managers access case management records and history for the person and track their work related to the person. And then the DSPD team also launched what is called UPI, the Utah Provider, the USteps Provider Interface. So direct support service providers access some information regarding individuals that they are authorized to support through that UPI system, that provider interface to their UStep system, including the instant reporting system. So anybody funded through DSPD as part of a DHHS contract agreement for services for individuals with disabilities, critical and non-critical incidents need to be reported in the UPI system as per DHHS contract agreements. So those need to be done, like I said, within 24 hours of the incident. UPI will automatically notify the caseworker in the system, but the parent and guardian won't automatically get that notification, but the caseworker or support coordinator would get it as part of doing that initial report in UPI. That initial report does not have to contain the full information. The full report needs to be done within 5 business days. The initial notification does need to contain the identification of the individual receiving services. So when you open UPI, you would pick the name of the person this incident involved, the date of the incident, the date the incident was discovered, and a brief description of what occurred. And then the screens in UPI will take you through all of the more detailed information that needs to be reported within that 5 business days. And then for critical incidents, there's some extra screens in UPI that the caseworker will also do and work with the provider on to provide even more detailed information. And there are some follow-up screens that the caseworker or support coordinator does in UPI for non-critical incidents to just ensure that the issues were handled, that support needs are still being met, that the team does or does not need to meet to discuss anything that needs to happen for that person to alter their services. So make sure for anybody that is working with DSPD funded individuals that you have access to the Utah Provider Interface system and are reporting instances, critical and non-critical instances for DHHS DSPD funded individuals through these systems. If you are supporting people outside of this service system through juvenile justice or youth services or service, child and family services, often all of those facilities are licensed and they need to follow the licensing rules, and then any non-critical instances would be reported through the details in that contract agreement, and my team can help walk you through those if that applies to you. If you have questions related to specific non-critical instances, contracted providers can contact the case manager for that case. DSPD also calls them support coordinators, so you'll hear caseworker or support coordinator kind of interchangeable in that service system. And you can also reach out to my team and get with one of your quality management review team members that help oversee the contract agreement compliance for the department at our Office of Service Review. And Katie and I will have contact information for both of us to enable you to reach out to our teams later on in this presentation. We'll turn it back to Katie for a few minutes.
Great, thanks. So just as a little bit of, I don't know, behind the scenes magic of how we follow up an incident report. Like I mentioned, the Office of Licensing, when we receive an incident report, we might not open up an investigation case and might not go further than just us receiving the report and processing it. But that all depends on what's included in the critical incident report, which is why I mentioned it's so important to provide as much detail as possible in critical incidents reports so that the likelihood that we need to ask questions goes down and clarify things goes down. So, if based on what's submitted, if the program appears to have complied with applicable law, each case is recorded in the provider portal. That provider portal is accessible from our website. There's also a direct link that will be in this presentation and accessible to you probably later on. In that provider portal, that report will still exist, but it will be in a closed status. If that report turns into something that is assigned to an investigator, that's how it also goes through our portal. It's opened. And then typically an investigator who either has some knowledge of that provider and that program, or maybe they are assigned to a certain region in Utah, that's who will go out and is assigned to follow up on the critical incident and gather more information. They might come out to do a formal inspection of the site. So that could include interviewing staff and clients or anybody who was involved with the critical incident. It could mean looking at documentation, whether that's the critical incident report documentation or documentation that is somehow related to the critical incident. They might also review footage if that's pertinent. And then after they've done that investigation, and in some cases, there might be a fine that gets assessed for any findings of noncompliance. We also, another formal agency action that we do as an office is to issue a plan of correction, which would kind of be like the guideline steps for how that provider prevents that incident from happening again. And that's something that investigators are certainly, it's well within their scope to do any monitoring for compliance with that. So even if there isn't a finding, or even if there isn't a plan of correction, a lot of times investigators might revisit a site depending on what happened to see, to observe what is happening or to review documentation again to see if anything's changed regarding that critical incident or the actions that were taken to either mitigate that critical incident or to report that critical incident if anything's changed in those ways. And that might be done by completing a formal follow-up inspection.
So Office of Service Review and Office of Licensing work closely together when incidents happen to see who might be taking the lead on follow-up, what might need to be done by either team. So there are incidences where you would see the Office of Service Review conducting possible follow-up for critical and non-critical incidents, depending on the information provided in the incident report. So if a provider appears to have complied with applicable DHHS contract agreement standards, Office of Service Review often does not, it doesn't warrant follow-up from us. If there is a need for possible contract corrective action or contract-specific technical assistance or guidance, we can and do reach out to either case managers, support coordinators, or direct support providers to provide that assistance. Office of Service Review also can and has visited contracted locations where services are being provided to DHHS clients. We will interview staff and or individuals in services. We will review documentation. In some cases, we will issue contract agreement corrective action for findings of noncompliance, and a plan of correction may be put into place to bring a provider into compliance with their DHHS contracted agreement. Office of Service Review may monitor a provider's compliance after a finding of noncompliance by completing follow-up on the implementation plan of correction. So this could be additional visits to that site. It could be visits to other sites that that provider manages, follow-up interviews with individuals and services or staff, whatever we deem appropriate to ensure that that plan of correction that that provider did led to coming back into compliance with their DHHS contracted agreement. So we do work in conjunction with the Office of Licensing, but they are focused on making sure you come into compliance with your licensing standards, and we're focused on making sure you come into compliance with your contract, DHHS contract agreement standards. So you could see one of the two teams, or you could see both teams, or you could see neither team, depending on the details of the incident report and the follow-up needed. Rachel, did you want us to read the case discussion, or did you want to go over that?
Absolutely. I'm happy to do either way, so I'll leave that up to you.
Okay. I am fine reading it. We planned for both eventualities. We just didn't clarify with you before. So before we moved onto this case agreement, we just wanted to double check that if there are any more questions on the information that Katie and I presented already, and we'd be happy to clarify anything that we said before we move on to this discussion. Okay, so background on this case. Your organization provides 24-hour residential services for several individuals with disabilities. One of your clients, Joyce, 28-year-old female, typically enjoys making arts and crafts, baking, and playing board games. She has been working on activities of daily living, including regular hygiene and learning how to bake more recipes. She often makes origami with other clients in the group home. Every time you see her, she greets you with a smile and a hug. Over the last couple of weeks, you have noticed that her demeanor has changed. Usually she is happy and excited to see you, but she seems reserved recently. Direct support staff have reported that she has been less engaged in baking lately. Primary area of concern. You receive a phone call from a direct support professional letting you know that Joyce has eloped after refusing her evening medications. You called Joyce's cell phone to ask what's going on. She's crying and says, "I want to die. My life is too hard." You ask her what's making you think that. She says, "I feel like I can't do anything and I feel so sad all the time. Nothing makes me happy anymore." She will not tell you where she is. She hangs up the phone and texts you goodbye. Out of concern for her safety, you call 988 to ask for help. You are able to get Joyce on the phone with a crisis worker, and she agrees to go to the hospital to help her stay safe. Goals and barriers. Goals. Report the incident according to the most recent guidelines. Identify signs that could have indicated Joyce might be experiencing a mental health concern. Community discussion. What elements of this scenario are important to report according to the most recent guidelines? So what do we all think? What elements of this scenario are important to report? And I can just, while you're thinking about that, go through all of the questions, and you're welcome to weigh in on any of them in this case discussion based on the background information. What signs could indicate that Joyce might have been experiencing a mental health concern? How would you approach addressing potential mental health concerns with Joyce after this crisis incident? Have you experienced a similar scenario before? So we'll give you some time to think about it, and then we'll let you voice your thoughts.
As I'm thinking about that first question, which elements of this scenario are important to report? If I'm remembering correctly, it would be important to include what happened before, during, and after the event. So I would include that conversation, the phone call, what the direct support professionals or support staff have reported, and then what you did to address the situation in the moment. So documenting that you contacted 988 and how that all played out.
It looks like somebody in the chat indicated her withdrawing from what she loves to do is an important thing to consider. Go ahead, James.
Um, what about, I know we've talked about one business day, but what if it happened late on a Friday night? 8 o'clock, she refused to take some nighttime meds, and then she somehow takes off. She somehow gets out and takes off. When do you report it? Because that's 2 full days before you can report it, correct?
Katie,
Or
do you
before
want to
you get
clarify
to,
that?
So for the Office of Licensing's requirements, it goes by business days. So as long as the report came in before the end of the day on Monday, and I mean 11:59 p.m. on Monday, that would technically still be okay.
That's a great question, James. But if I'm remembering correctly, also they expect that you would notify if this person has a legal guardian. You would need to notify them within 24 hours, which is not the same business day, correct?
That's right. Yep.
I was thinking that her response of just after she says, like, I feel sad all the time, nothing makes me happy anymore, and then she just hangs up the phone and texts you goodbye. I mean, that would be definitely a discussion point for therapy sessions is, you know, that really doesn't work for us as a therapist, that she does that. And so having safety plans in place, discussing with her about that reality of when she checks out like that, that's pretty emotional on our part, that we would continue to be worried about them, you know, resort, you know, us calling 988 and all that stuff, but also helping Joyce to understand that we care for her and we worry about her. And that kind of response only makes it hard on us as therapists because we continue to worry about her.
So there's this weird thing. Yeah, I think that's a great response to that question about how you would approach addressing potential mental health concerns with Joyce after the crisis incident. So talking through skills to use in that scenario and how that situation affected everybody else. I think that's a great follow-up, Matthew.
Anybody else has thoughts on this scenario?
I do. I think it's plausible that maybe other staff are informed that this happened. Maybe the next day or the next days, especially after a hospitalization, it's probably, you know, it makes the rounds internally about where Joyce is at this time. So that's probably something pertinent that you can include in a report like this. Like, we'll continue to monitor. There will be visits, whatever ends up happening, and obviously that any other pertinent staff that need to know that this has happened should be informed. So that's something like a little detail that could be included.
is it still a critical incident if, say, for example, I said, you know, that late Friday night, she had this incident where she eloped and you got her back, and by Sunday she was calmed down enough to where she was not a threat to herself. Is it still considered a critical incident when you report it on Monday? Or is it a non-critical incident?
How long was she missing?
Let's say a couple, 3 hours or longer, which I don't know. Is it like a 10-hour, 24-hour period? Then that's a critical incident. Or if it's like 2 or 3 hours and you're able to get to her, is that a non-critical incident if she's calmed down by Sunday?
I'd say if significant time has passed and you establish that this person is definitely not with you or around you, then that would need to be reported.
But it's non-critical or critical?
The Office of Licensing defines a missing client as critical.
Okay, so that would be, it would no longer be, it wouldn't be non-critical because she'd calm down and everything. She'd still report it as critical.
I would recommend that, yes. Because that will cover your bases. And even if we don't end up opening a case or we deem, well, actually, this didn't need to be reported, at least you've done your part and there's no question that you reported it.
So I will share that last question. Have you experienced a similar scenario before? Before my role here at the IDRPB, I was in disability services, and we had, I witnessed several accounts that are not the same as this, but similar. So where it included an element of maybe elopement, a threat of self-harm, where we were concerned for someone's safety. So I think this happens, I don't want to say often, but it's important. This scenario specifically, where there's a mental health concern involved, I think this kind of scenario is important to think about and walk through for all disability service providers and direct support professionals, knowing the best way to address and then how to report and follow up with them. I think these mental health related scenarios are super important.
Yes, they can be like super important, especially like we encourage in the DSPD system, it's called person-centered planning teams, to like consider all of the history this person has, the current support needs, the current concerns around all of that, like have discussions of, as teams, be in contact with each other when behavior changes like this, like in this scenario where there's a shift in behavior that everybody starts to notice. We would encourage team meetings to happen to try and problem solve why that might be occurring, like what other services and supports they might need, what staff might need to look for just to be prepared. Because often mental health support is not recognized as easily, and there's not as much like service providers available to individuals with intellectual disabilities and related conditions that understand how to provide the like best support to people in services that have support needs. So if there are, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to move on if nobody had any other comments on it.
That's what I was going to say as well. Go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, just really quickly, I've included the link to our provider portal. So anybody in the session, you might not be the people using this necessarily, but this is where it lives in the web. So ccl.utah.gov is the URL, and there's a tab on the side that the provider can see where it has the form. And every single kind of line that we walked through about the data that's required exists in that form. It's pretty straightforward. But if anybody has questions, I'm a resource for that, so feel free to reach out. Okay, and now we're just on to contact information. We've included some of the pertinent critical incident reporting resources here. So that reporting guide I mentioned is linked here. This is also all available on our Office of Licensing website. The general provisions rule that I mentioned that defines certain things is linked here, in addition to our rule interpretation manual. And that rule interpretation manual just expounds on how the office interprets the rule in order to provide enforcement and compliance. So that's a good resource if you want to know, both for the general provisions rule and for the enforcement rule, how we look at the rule. And if there are ever any updates to the rule interpretation manuals, providers are notified of it. We are due for a new critical incident reporting guide, so that should be coming soon, or at least it should be finalized since our rule was recently changed. And our contact information is both down there at the bottom. So that's all I have. Jessica, do you want to add anything?
Just a reminder, like that yellow note said earlier in the presentation, like if you are unsure if you should report it, please err on the side of caution and over-report instead of under-reporting. We would prefer to have the knowledge of what happened and how you reacted rather than find out about it later and then have to do some kind of correction or technical assistance when we deemed it should have been reported and it wasn't. So definitely, for sure, if you have questions about critical incident reporting guidelines or your DHHS contract agreement around critical and non-critical incidents, reach out to Katie or myself. Our teams would be happy to help. So thank you. We appreciate you all inviting us. We appreciate your time and the discussion we've had. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jessica and Katie. It's nice for me, it was very educational to hear about the updated guidelines and to think through that case scenario. So much appreciated. This, as I mentioned earlier, this has been recorded and it will be available on our Canvas page if you'd ever like to review it or any of our other sessions that we've had in this series. This is the last session in this series, so we will get that information about our next series sent out within the next week or so. So if you are interested, you can register for that. Otherwise, we'll wrap up early today. And again, thanks so much, Jessica and Katie, and thank you everyone else who joined today and took some time to learn about this with us.